Hello everyone and welcome to our new Lifehack with focus on optimization. Specifically today we will be talking about parametrization, and we will do that using the same case that we showed in our webinar. So for those of you who missed it, on May 4th, a couple of weeks ago, we showed a webinar where we demonstrated a workflow to optimize a radial compressor with regard to aerodynamic performance and structural integrity. And in this webinar, we presented a workflow that we used, which is called surrogate-based optimization, which consists of different steps that we will cover in various life hacks. And today, as I mentioned, we will be focusing on parametrization. All right, so let's get started. First of all, what do you need for that? Essentially, you need a parametric modeler, which is able to fully define your geometry, and in the best case, that has batch and scripting capabilities. For instance, for turbo machines, you could use Accent or AutoBlade. So the demo case that we showed in our webinar, we built in Accent, which you can see down here. If you do optimizations with more complex free-form surfaces, you could use Cases or Grasshopper from Rhino, which you can see right here, which you could use to do ship hull optimization, or here we optimized a catamaran. So depending on your application, different programs to do the geometry generation and the parametric modeling might be efficient. What does a good parametric model should look like? Essentially, the first important prerequisite is that it has to be capable to create an accurate representation of your geometry. So to pick up an example, our colleague used in the previous life hack, if the red points right here represent a discrete version of your geometry and the gray curves here represent a parametrization, those, of course, they should match as good as possible. So that is something you always have to consider if you do not start with a parametric model from scratch, but instead you start off some CAD geometry. And then you always have to create a parametric model, and that parametric model should represent this original CAD as good as possible. Next, it should include, so that is your model, should include all geometrical features that have a significant influence on your objective or your constraints. And I will give you an example by jumping into Accent. What you see here is the baseline model that we used for our optimization that we showed in our webinar. And you might remember that our objective was to maximize efficiency while also improving structural integrity. And there are a lot of parameters that are important to achieve this goal, but two, for instance, would be the blade angle distribution along the shroud or the thickness. So if I just switch to the blade angle distribution here and activate the editation for the shroud, it's important that our optimizer has access or is able to change this blade angle distribution up here. Otherwise, we will most likely not be able to get the best possible efficiency. And the same goes for the thickness. So the blade stresses will also depend on the thickness of the blade, and thus these points here should also be part of your parametric model. All right, so let's go back to our presentation. A very important aspect is also the stability of your parametric model. So your parametric model has to be able to create valid variations of your geometry. So if we just stick with this animation right here for a moment, this is also something that we showed during our webinar. As you can see, the changes, especially during the DOE, are quite significant. So it's important that your model is able to do these changes in a stable way. Stable means that, for instance, your blade thickness must not be negative, or that your shroud radius is not lower than your hub radius. Things like that. So you have to set up your model with free parameters and maybe also mathematical expressions to ensure that you receive as many valid designs as possible. Now, to continue with our list, also a very important point is to have as many free parameters as necessary, but as few as possible. What that basically means, or what you have to consider, is that during your DOE, the more parameters you have, the larger your design space is. And the more, maybe not always, but the more complex your model gets, and the more samples you need during the DOE to create a valid model. And that is something that is usually up to the engineer to decide which parameters are necessary and which parameters you could neglect. And I will be also showing this by means of our model in Accent. The model we used contained a total of 27 parameters, representing, for instance, the shroud contour, the hub contour, the blade angle distribution, and so on. And the impeller itself was created by using a definition for hub and shroud, and then just assuming a linear variation along the shroud. So essentially, the blade itself is defined by two sections, hub and shroud. And for our case, this was absolutely fine. However, if you, for instance, have a transonic compressor, it might sometimes be beneficial to add additional parameters. So for instance, you could use a definition for a swept leading edge where you have additional parameters here. Let me just get up a 3D model so you can see what that might look like. So if you have a very high flow coefficient, that might be useful. Or also, sometimes necessary, you need additional sections to define your blade. For instance, you could just define additional sections right here, and then your blade geometry would be defined on a total of 5 sections. And you could also use mathematical expressions to link each of those sections to one another. The idea here simply is that you have to include all parameters that are essential to, first of all, define your geometry completely and also to achieve your objectives. However, it might not be necessary if we take the inflow right here, for instance. Here I chose to simply have 2 parameters. Or essentially 4. So ZR coordinates here at this point and at this point. It's not necessary to have, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 points or even 3 parameters here. It's just not necessary at this point. At least that's what I decided for our optimization. Of course, it's always up to the user to specify this. Also, you might consider the manufacturing process. So if you remember what I just showed in Accent, having multiple sections along the span might lead to the fact that your geometry has to be manufactured using point milling. So if that is not an option, then having multiple sections might also cause some issues down the road. That is also something that you should decide in advance. Last point that I mentioned here, it might also be helpful to use dependencies between different parameters. Now, what might that look like? Let's take our swept leading edge as an example. In our case, we would get for this swept leading edge 4 additional parameters. The Z coordinates for both points and the radius at both points. However, you could also create an expression linking the radius to the radius of the shroud. So for instance, if this radius here is a free parameter and this would be a free parameter, you could create an expression for the radius of those two parameters to be equally distributed between hub and shroud, and then only the z coordinate would be a free parameter. So that would spare you two parameters which you could use, which you could either leave out completely or use it on a different part of your geometry. And that concludes my list. There are probably a lot more points that one could mention here. However, the idea here is to simply give you a brief overview of how a parametric model could look like. If you have further questions, please feel free to send us an email. We are always happy to supply you with a demo license or to answer your questions. Just like I said, feel free to contact us. That's pretty much it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a nice day.